The South Sea bubble is quoted alongside tulip mania as an example of the irrationality of investors who put hard-earned cash into worthless pieces of paper. Tulip mania was a period during the 1600s when contract prices for bulbs of the recently introduced and fashionable tulip reached extraordinarily high levels. Tulips, along with other new plants like potatoes, peppers, tomatoes and other vegetables, came to Europe around this time. The major acceleration started in 1634 and then dramatically collapsed in February 1637. It is generally considered to have been the first recorded speculative or asset bubble in history. The term tulip mania is now often used to refer to any large economic bubble when asset prices deviate from the intrinsic value. At its peak in February 1637, single tulip bulbs sold for more than 10 times the annual income of a skilled worker. The plant was different from other flowers known to Europe at that time because of its intense saturated petal colour. Its popularity as a status symbol coincides with the rise of Amsterdam merchants, who were at the centre of the lucrative East Indies trade, where one voyage could yield profits of 400%. As a result, tulips rapidly became a coveted luxury item, and a profusion of varieties followed. As the flowers grew in popularity, growers paid higher and higher prices for the bulbs, and prices rose steadily. By 1634, in part as a result of demand from the French, speculators began to enter the market. The contract price of rare bulbs continued to rise throughout 1636. By November, the price of common bulbs also began to increase, so that soon any tulip bulb fetched hundreds of guilders. One example is 12 acres of land was offered for one bulb. The mania reached its peak during the winter of 1636, when some contracts were changing hands 5 times, because in February 1637, tulip bulb prices collapsed abruptly, and the trade ground to a halt. A contemporary account suggests that the crisis started to unravel on the 3rd of February, when an auctioneer failed to find any buyers, despite lowering the asking price several times. The prices continued to spiral downwards as investors scrambled to recover their cash, but many were ruined by the fall in prices, and Dutch commerce suffered a severe shock. It is true that gullibility and greed are as old as the hills, but this episode is not about pretty flowers, but something much more deep-seated, which still is having a detrimental effect in Britain today, and shows that our views can change over time. This is the South Sea Bubble scandal. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were a time of great economic change. The old order of a society based largely on the land, where everyone knew their place, was being challenged by new economic forces. These included paper money, from banknotes to cheques, insurance and joint stock companies. Today we take these things for granted, but for contemporaries these ideas were viewed with great suspicion. The Chancellor of the Exchequer of Britain faced a major problem. Each government department was responsible for its own budget, and he could only estimate overall government debt as around £9 million. Suppliers to one key government department, the Navy, were refusing to do their patriotic duty and actually do some supplying on credit. Today we take it for granted that the government may not be the quickest payer, but you will get paid at some time. At first, the government used that old favourite, a lottery, to raise funds. When this proved inadequate, they turned to the private sector for help. In 1711, the South Sea Company was set up, not to deal in government debt, but to trade in slaves. The Royal Africa Company had shown that there was good money in this deplorable activity. But trading slaves was a tricky business. First, you had to deal with powerful African chieftains on the west coast of Africa, who tended to be picky in the goods they received from Europe. The Royal Africa Company had acquired a number of forts along the coast, of which the most famous is Cape Coast Castle. It offered a safe harbour, dungeons for the enslaved, and a warehouse. Next, you had to get them to the slave market in the Americas on a sailing boat that usually took about 6 or more weeks, depending on favourable winds. It could take up to 3 months. The company was founded solely to exploit the Central and South American slave markets, hence the title South Seas. It carried around 4,800 slaves per year, as against at least 10 times that figure for the Royal Africa Company. Its charter stated that the sole aim is to trade and traffic from the 1st of August 1711 into, unto, and from the kingdoms, lands, etc., of the Americas on the east side, from the river Aronques to the southernmost port of Terra del Fuego. The Bank of England was relieved of its duty to run the lottery, and the South Sea Company took over the role. The first tranche was phenomenally successful, but the second failed as everyone was guaranteed a win. This showed that the new economic ideas could be flawed, but it did show that a new company could match the Bank of England in managing the nation's finances. The company did not need to issue more shares to cover the outstanding debt, as it had arranged a favourable deal where it could swap its shares at the current market price rather than the nominal value of £100. As the share price was £142, it was able to offload its surplus shares at a healthy profit. A national debt investigation concluded that a total of £9 million was owed by the government, with no specifically allocated income to pay it off. Robert Harley, then Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and John Blunt had jointly devised a scheme to consolidate this debt in much the same way as the Bank of England had consolidated previous debts, although the bank still held the monopoly for operating as a bank. All holders of the debt, that is creditors, would be required to surrender it to the new company, formed for the purpose, the South Sea Company, which in return would issue them shares in itself to the same nominal value. The government would make an annual payment to the company of £568,279, equating to 6% interest plus expenses, which could then be redistributed to the shareholders as a dividend. The company was also granted a monopoly to trade with South America, a potentially lucrative enterprise, but one controlled by Spain, with whom Britain was at war. As part of the Treaty of Utrecht, the company could use the South American ports of Buenos Aires, Cartagena, Havana, Panama, and Vera Cruz. This slave trading practice was known as the Asiento del Negres and would last 30 years. A 400-ton ship was allowed to enter these ports with its own goods, rather than just its human cargo. In return, the King of Spain would receive 1/4 of all profits. The king never received his share, and hostilities between the two countries broke out in 1718. Even in good times, the South Sea Company was always being accused of carrying contraband in the regular trips to the concession ports. It was never a happy arrangement, and it needed a second source of revenue. When it was founded, Spain and Britain were at war, so it was unlikely that any British ships could offload their cargo without Spanish approval. It would have to wait for peace negotiations. So why did it all go ahead And why was it a success? On the face of it, a new investor was not buying into the next East India Company, but a gamble on a venture that could only work if there were genuine peace negotiations and Britain acquired the right to trade in Central and South America. Both business and politics met at this point. The real aim by both the politicians and the businessmen was to set up a bank, and that needed parliamentary approval to override the Bank of England's monopoly. 12 new Tory peers were appointed to push the necessary legislation through Parliament. At the same time, a press campaign was launched to promote the South Sea Company's aims. For anyone who subscribed to the initial public offering, the terms were excellent. The shares were a bargain, as for £100 nominal value, you could purchase the shares at a discounted price of £55. For his services to the nation, the king got 25% of the company. Critics of the scheme, such as politician Sir Robert Walpole, wanted the stock to be exchanged at a specific price, rather than its current market value. The government did not pay the 6% debt due for 2 years, and the company was able to be allowed to increase its share capital to compensate for its loss of revenue. The Prince of Wales, later to become George II, was made ceremonial governor of the South Sea Company. When father, George I, and son quarrelled, the king threw his son off the board and assumed his role and investments. The king over time became an active investor in the South Sea Company shares and encouraged his mistress, the Duchess of Kendal, to participate in buying the stock. The price kept going up, and a letter from someone by the name of Mrs. Wyndham to relatives in Norfolk shows what happens when the public lose all connection with financial reality. She wrote, "South Sea is all the talk and fashion. The ladies sell their jewels to buy, and happy they are in. Mr. Whitworth gave me 200 guineas for South Sea stock. Never was such a time to get money in as now." Whilst the public were blissfully unaware that the South Sea Company was founded on shaky ground, as the company could speculate in its own shares for profit, John Blunt embarked on more financial schemes to prop up the share price. He put the proposal to Parliament to consolidate all the nation's debt of £31 million. The company's market capital in June 1720 was £300 million, making it the largest financial institution in the world. It was owed £60 million, which was greater than the GDP of Britain. Dealing with Parliament was going to be tricky, and he needed to offer them various sweeteners or bribes. But blatant financial corruption was dangerous, so he hit upon a scheme whereby members of Parliament could pay a 20% down payment for their shares, and the balance paid off when the shares were sold in the future. It worked. To the man or woman in the street, they could get loans up to £3,000 to purchase their slice of the company. In June 1720, Blunt was made a baronet for his services to the company and to the nation. But everything depended on the price of the shares increasing, so that new shares could be released onto the market. Ironically, the company was hoisted by its own petard. Its success had led to a flurry of share flotations for various ventures, some of which were genuine and others fanciful, such as one to promote the creation of what was termed flying machines. Blunt lobbied for what became known as the Bubble Act, which meant that the joint stock companies had to obtain a royal charter. This was designed to stop others tapping the market. The share price kept rising. The next tranche of shares released was very successful, as it raised £1 million, with a yield of 10%. But the final tranche was a disaster, as it called for a dividend of 30%, which needed a profit of 15 million, or a quarter of Britain's GDP. Within weeks, the top price of £1,050 had been reduced to a lowly 142. What is interesting about this is that it touched all levels of society. Unfortunately, it was just the beginning, and financial scandals have been a regular occurrence in modern capitalism since that date. The scandal of the price crash brought forward a series of pamphlets, playing cards, and editorials in the newspapers. A typical example is the poem by Jonathan Swift, who changed his position as a cheerleader for the scheme to an opponent. It read as follows: "As fishes on each other prey, the great ones swallowing up the small, so face it in the South Sea, the whale director eat up all." An engraving by Hogarth gives a neat summary of the public's attitude at the time. It had the catchy title of "Emblematic Print on the South Sea Scheme." It sold for 1 shilling. It is set in London around the monument to the Fire of London on the left, and the Guildhall on the right. In the background is St. Paul's Cathedral. On the monument is an inscription. This monument was created in memory of the destruction of the city by the South Sea in 1720. In the centre we see a wheel of fortune, or merry-go-round, with easily recognisable caricatures, including on the left a clergyman and a whore, and on the right a housewife and a Scots nobleman on a horse. Below is a baying mob. In Great Britain, many investors were ruined by the share price collapse, and as a result, the national economy diminished substantially. The founders of the scheme had engaged in insider trading by using their advanced knowledge of the timings of national debt consolidations to make large profits from purchasing debt in advance. Huge bribes were given to politicians to support the Acts of Parliament necessary for the scheme. Company money was used to deal in its own shares, and selected individuals purchasing shares were given cash loans backed by those same shares to spend on purchasing more shares. The expectation of profits from trade with South America was talked up to encourage the public to purchase shares, but the bubble prices reached far beyond what was the actual profits of the business, namely the slave trade, could justify. A parliamentary inquiry was held after the bursting of the bubble to discover its causes. A number of politicians were disgraced, and people found to have profited immorally from the company had personal assets confiscated proportionate to their gains. Most had already been rich and remained so. Finally, the company was restructured and continued to operate for more than a century after the bubble. The headquarters were in Threadneedle Street, at the centre of the City of London, and the financial district of the capital. At the time of these events, the Bank of England was also a private company dealing in national debt, and the crash of its rival confirmed its position as banker to the British government. One man was going to become Britain's longest-serving Prime Minister as a result of this scandal. He was Sir Robert Walpole. He had just sold some South Sea Company investments and was about to reinvest the proceeds when he was warned against it by his friend and finance manager, Robert Jacomb. Instead, he was to lead the charge against the company and be a hero to the people. But this is a very dangerous practice. Everyone who mattered from the king downwards was horribly implicated in the affair. In 1719, the Jacobites tried to seize the throne, and the grip of the monarchy was precarious. In order to get the top job, Walpole had to keep the king on side. But someone had to take the blame. As an aside, the new monarch could not speak English, and George I and Walpole, as First Lord of the Treasury, apparently conversed in Latin. As in all political dramas, a secret committee was set up in Parliament. Walpole was keen that the correct type of people should be on it, and thus influence their thinking, and not certain members of the establishment. Blunt, who was happy to deal with the authorities, was denounced by Walpole in Parliament, and was going to be left with £1,000. In the event, his friends enabled him to retire to Bath with £5,000, and his baronetcy. It is still in the family today. But the real target, and perhaps the scapegoat for this financial disaster, was the company cashier Robert Knight, who kept a green ledger with all the details of who had been bribed. He was questioned by the secret committee, and over the weekend fled the country and ended up in the Netherlands. Luckily for him, Britain and the Netherlands did not have an extradition treaty. A local British Foreign Office official was not aware of the delicate nature of Robert Knight's plight and arranged for his arrest. A group of MPs tried to interview him, but Walpole was able to thwart them. Knight was transferred to various prisons, finally ending up in one in Antwerp. He left one evening with his jailer and made his way to France. Until the fall of Walpole 20 years later, he was an exile. In 1742 he returned to Britain, where he became an MP and was made an earl before dying in 1745. Despite all his assets in the UK being seized, he'd been able to rebuild his fortune in Paris. The Green Ledger book was never recovered. Everyone, provided they had the money, could buy into the South Sea Company. The stock jobbers in the coffee houses of Change Alley did not differentiate between either the classes or the genders. Fortunes were being made and lost outside the norms of polite society. Women could pawn their jewels and play the stock exchange on the margins. As all debts to the company had to be honoured in the event of a slump in prices, a husband or guardian was responsible for her debts. If they did not pay, they could end up in the debtor's prison. To contemporaries, society was changing, and not necessarily for the better. In the end, the Bank of England and the East India Company bought the now worthless shares between them, and the dodgy loans were cancelled. It has been noted by some critics that there was no mention of slavery, but this is irrelevant in 1720. It was felt to be the natural order of things. Thomas Guy, who founded Guy's Hospital in London, or Edward Colston, who founded almshouses and a school in Bristol, were not some brutal slave traffickers, but respected business people who were expected to do their bit for society. The type of activity that Blunt and his cronies were undertaking would have resulted in serious jail time and hefty fines if caught. They were involved in insider trading after all, overvaluation of company assets, bribery of key government officials, and loans to buy their own shares. We forget that these were the early days of modern capitalism, and it would take many years before these abuses of the market were outlawed. The legendary investor Warren Buffett noted that stock market bubbles result from the actions of three types of investors: innovators, imitators, and idiots. The South Sea bubble neatly slotted into this last category, with the Bank of England as the innovator, the South Sea Company as the imitator, with the public as the idiot. If someone had bought stock at £1,050, the company would need to earn at least £60 to maintain a yield of 6%. This was impossible, as contemporaries pointed out. What people failed to realise is that they were dealing with paper profits, not actual profits in cash. Only when you sell can you gloat on your profits or despair at your losses. So what happened to the company? It survived, and apart from a venture into whaling, handled government debt until it was wound up by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in exchange for undated bonds. These were only redeemed in 2015 by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne. The South Sea Company never suffered the fate of its French rival, the Mississippi Company. It was established by a Scots economist called John Law, who consolidated the economies of the French overseas territories into a trading company and founded the first central bank in Europe, called the Banque Royale. Basically, the French had put all their financial eggs into one basket. Once the edifice tumbled, John Law was forced to flee the country and ended his days in London in poverty. Is there a moral to this story? Maybe do proper research. To give you just one example, the South Sea Company was supposed to be the next East India Company, but the latter was sending 3 ships a month to India, whilst the former could only send 1 vessel per year to each of the concession ports. If the subject is too difficult to master, then avoid it if you do not want to be classified, as Warren Buffett put it, an idiot.